Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 1st of August 2024. It's a stiflingly hot day. I hope I don't melt by the end of the video. If you don't know what the lines on my video mean, or lines on my map, and indeed video mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Pause the video. Right, let's go to the front lines. We'll go to the north first, to the northern of the two. You've got the northern sector by Hliobike, north of Kharkiv, and then northeast of Kharkiv around Vovchansk. There are some changes to Andrew Perpetua's mapping around a few fields to the south of Hliobike. I would put my money, although not a lot of money, on that being a rejig rather than a counterattack in the area, but I could be wrong. I haven't looked in detail at what his claims might have been surrounding that area, but some Russian gains to the map there. Then when we move further to the east, we come to Vovchansk, a city that's had one hell of a battering since May the 10th, I think it was, where the Ukrainians were pushed back from the border. Some Russians gains a few buildings to the northern part of the sector inside the city. But Syriac maps admitting now that the Russians have been pushed back to the north of Vovcha River. They don't have purchase to the south there. That had been claimed a couple of days ago, I think, by reporting from Ukraine. Check his videos out to detail that. And also a few buildings north of the river as well. There is a difference here between Andrew Perpetua, who has the building surrounded, the aggregates plant surrounded, but in control of the Russians more in a greater sense than the Syriac map here, having half of the aggregates plant under control of the Russians, and that being connected to the rest of the Russian control zone by this pathway through the city or through the town. That's quite a significant distinction between the two mappers, and one, it has the Russians surrounded and the other doesn't. I think it's a bit hit and miss. So sometimes they do get to the aggregates plant, but it's not a solid path, and that's probably why Andrew has it as a grey zone, really. Right, then we're going to come down. So that's good news for the Ukrainians in that particular sector. We're going to come down to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatove to Kreminna, and this is around Kupiansk, just to the northeast of Kupiansk, in the Sinkivka area, just to the west of east of there, where a couple of fields have been taken according to both mappers. This is, I think, an area where, again, reporting from Ukraine has done a video. So you can go and check that out. Just to go, I just forgot to say that Syriac map says about Vovchansk. I often do this, I do apologise. Situation on northern front and the axis for the Chuhiv axis for the battle for Vovchansk. The fighting south of the aggregate plant confirms that Russian troops withdrew from their temporary positions south of Vovcha River. Meanwhile, the Russian army advanced on new high buildings. That's further to the north, as mentioned. So this is what they say about the area near Sinkivka. The Russian army continues shelling Sinkivka. Its troops advance to the east of the locality. So that is the situation there. Then when we come further to the south, before we get there, it's worth noting that there's been a couple of days of stasis around Pischani, which is good news because Syriac maps had the Russians making some really large-scale gains both north and west of Pischani. Andrew Perpetua has the Russians controlling far less of that area. Big difference between those two mappers. And when it's not in these places like these urban environments that you see these slow grinding gains. So some big differences around here, some big differences around Stelmakivka. I think it's often because Syriac maps is overzealous, right? And maps based on what the Russian MOD or certain Russian commanders say, even though there are strong hints that those claims might be a little bit dubious. And then you get to situations like this, and I think this is probably a good example. Here we have the situation on the Luhansk front. Map corrections were made in Sahivka. So this is admitting that there was something wrong with the previous mapping, showing Ukrainian army in control of more territory than previously showed. This territory was probably under their control since August 2023. So this is actually a year out of date when the Ukrainian army managed to stop Russian advances there and reverse most of the gains. And this is going back to, if you remember, in the Ryarodka area, you had these big gains for for the Russians moving around. So there's Ryarodka moving around Novohayarivka, which I think is further down here somewhere. There it is, Novohayarivka. And Surat Maps had them going like quite far out here. Andrew Perpetua was a little bit more conservative, and this is an admission that Surat Maps was indeed wrong, and he's now a year later saying, yeah, I was wrong. And I've been wrong for a year, which is, it's good to admit that. But then you look at some of these other places and you wonder whether that is similar to what is going on elsewhere, where there are these huge differences between the mappers in terms of multiple kilometers in a number of locations. So I think that is kind of evidence that Surat Maps is indeed overzealous. Okay, that's not to say they're always wrong, and I think in the urban areas they're probably more correct, but more because the Russians will eventually take that, even if they haven't at the time that Surat Maps claims those victories. Some gains for the Russians just to the west of Kamazianivka. The Russians taking a few fields there, as according to Andrew Perpetua, and getting some purchase in a tree line going westwards towards, well, a long way off the Oskil River, but in that direction. No change to the Terny and Tulska area, no change to Serebyansky Forest and to this first front line, no change to Chaziv Yar, which is really good news for the Ukrainians. Not to say there isn't hard fighting going on in all of those places. The next changes are around the Torska area, where Surat Maps has some fairly substantial changes along a wide area here of the Zalizhny district and into Krytry Rynok. A number of roads there now being under Russian control, fully under their control, as they are just advancing to the northwest. Here we have claims about that. So right, in Druzhba, troops took control over the street of... In fact, I don't have that. I've missed that one off. That's quite a small one. So Druzhba's just up here. So they've taken control over a small area there. Apologies for that. As you can see, tiny little gain there. But they've taken control, the Russians, over the street of Dzhezhinskoho, while the town of Zalizhny and the operation to take the Terikon of Artyom mine began with the Russian army advancing from two axes to flank this elevation. So that is to say, further to the south here, they are trying to take this high ground there, which you could imagine will be quite useful. There's two of these, and no one over here. I mean, there have been lots previously, but these ones were behind the 2014 line. It's this one that was taken, a few more around here as they march onto Zalizhny. So I wonder how much the Ukrainians will be working hard to keep this, how difficult that will be for the Russians to take, full stop. And then as we come over here towards the north, so we're going in a northwards direction, there's another one just here. Those will be useful for the Ukrainians, but sometimes you find that with these terracons, with these kind of spoilings, heaps and whatnot, that actually, yes, they do get good visuals on the enemy, but it means that they also stick out like a sore thumb. So Russian drones will be able to know exactly what's going on up here, and there's not that much cover provided. So it's useful for the Ukrainians, more useful than it isn't, but it can attract a lot of attention. Okay, moving on further to the south to New York area, and you can see that Russians are making some gains inside the New York settlement itself, as well as further to the south along the tree lines and fields along the base of that bridgehead towards Pantelemonivka. We'll go back to the ISW that says, if we go to the map here, in New York, the Russian army continued advancing inside the town, taking control over the bread plant and the rest of Petrovsky Novgorod machine building plant. Meanwhile, Russian forces continue advancing towards Pantelemonivka, taking control over new positions around the hills overlooking this locality. In Druzhba, troops took control over the street of Dzhezhinskoho as mentioned. And then, yeah, I've already told you about that, so I won't say that again. So there you go. The Russians making grinding gains still, and then continuing to make some fairly significant gains in the Pokrovsk direction, going ever westwards towards Pokrovsk. They seem to have stopped a little bit going northwest towards Vozdizhenka, and towards the T0504 highway that connects Pokrovsk to Konstantinivka. But they are successfully moving westwards towards Hrodivka and Pokrovsk. This is a worry. Andrew Perpetua and Surat Maps showing moves to the north, successful gains for the Russians. Surat Maps agreeing with what Andrew Perpetua previously said of gains for the Russians south of Lozovatska, just there, and north of Pokres. We have Surat Maps then showing more charitable gains around Vesely, between Pokres and Vesely, and then south of Vesely along the railway line, the Russians making some gains. I think a bit of a rejig there to show they don't yet have control over some of this territory that Surat Maps had previously suggested. And then south of Vovcha, the Russians taking control over more land there. So yeah, quite a lot of gain in those areas. As you can see from Surat Maps here, they really are doing a good job of moving fairly quickly and fairly consistently in this direction. Russian army took control, says Surat Maps, over most of the village of Timofivka. In the northeastern farms remain under the Ukrainian army control so far, and began advancing towards Ivanivka from the south and the west. So let's go and put that on the map. Let's go and find out where Timofivka, there it is, Timofivka. So they're having some success there, and they're moving towards Ivanivka, trying to approach it from several directions there. Okay, to continue, in addition, Russian forces advanced south of Vesely along the railway line towards Sahivka. Moreover, troops began advancing southwards towards the western shore of the Volcha River, reaching the first Ukrainian trench system. I wonder if that's one of the main trench systems. We're expecting the Ukrainians to have some major fortification set up somewhere around here. It could be further to the east, closer to where the Russians are at the moment. Who knows? That'll be something that the Russians will be trying to prepare for. Will they have enough in the tank to be able to overcome those defences? Right, then as we move further to the south, Andrew Perpetua has the Ukrainians ceding more territory in Krasnohorivka, the Russians pushing north there. That's actually in line with what Surat Maps had previously said. In fact, there's still a difference between those two mappers. And coming further to the south, this is quite sad for me. Pobieda held out so well. It was this agricultural settlement, rather like Novelska, further to the north near Avdiivka. Pobieda is this place that had stopped Mariinka becoming... getting flanked really by the Russians. It held the Russians back to the south of Mariinka, and it did a really good job, but it has now been not only taken over, but the Russians are moving further down that road. And this is a slight worry, because as the Russians move west of Novomykhailivka through Paraskovivka, they are trying to take Konstantinivka. There have been a number of repelled attacks, quite large-scale attacks. Surat Maps has a bit of a gain for the Russians on the outskirts of Konstantinivka, but it looks like they might be trying to come down the road as well. Looks like the town of Konstantinivka will eventually be attacked from two flanks there. And of course, this is the key to the road that links down to Vuhledar, past Vodyane, that the Russians are trying to approach from the east. Well, it could be that Konstantinivka eventually does fall, and that would be really challenging for, I think, the Ukrainians in this whole area. I think that's the domino that allows the Russians to take, or that's that first falling domino that allows them to take all of this whole area here. So we'll see how much the Ukrainians try and hold out in that area. Now, one more change, in the Robotyne area, and actually both mappers broadly agree that the Russians have made some gains around Robotyne. First of all, Andrew Perpetua to the south of the town, having now solid control over more of Robotyne itself. There's been arguments as to whether the Russians control Robotyne or not. It's a little bit like Klishchiivka. It's completely flattened and it offers very little in terms of shelter. And so controlling it means kind of not a lot. You are very vulnerable there. There's not a lot to conceal yourself. So it's easier to label this as a grey zone. But if the Russians are moving up further to the west, as both mappers seem to indicate, the northwest, then actually they'll be better able to control the Robotyne urban area, and then also, so according to Surat maps, controlling areas to the east as well. So it's looking like the Russians are slowly but surely taking back all of the territory that they lost after May the 30th. So this white line was May the 30th from last year, before the Ukrainians did their counterattack. So you could say that really the Ukrainians are still up here. It's been over a year and the Russians haven't got back to where the Ukrainians started. Depends how you evaluate these things, because there are plenty of areas where, Velika Novosilka is an area where the Ukrainians still have more than the Russians. But then you come over to elsewhere, Avdiivka and down on the southern Donetsk front, and the Russians have gone quite a considerable distance from that grey-white line there. New York, Toretsk, around Chasiv Yar, although they still don't have Klishchiivka, and then further up here in the Seversk front line. That white line is useful to give you an understanding of what the Russians have achieved since May the 30th, over and above what the Ukrainians might have achieved. Although the Ukrainians still have some areas that they have gained and not conceded. Okay, we are going to go to Ukraine the latest and listen to Roland Oliphant talk about an article he and others wrote concerning an evaluation for how successful the Russian offensive period has been for them, this summer offensive period, and where we're at. I really like this because it agrees with what I've been saying. The point is it is a kind of validation sometimes, imposter syndrome. What do I know? What who am I? How do I know that I'm correct? I don't. But when you get validation like this, you're like, okay, right, I'm on the right track. That's good. So not everything I say is complete nonsense. So listen to these guys and let me know whether you agree with their conclusions.
Afternoon, David. We kind of took a step back. I mean, the premise was, look, around about May, so around about the time the Russians launched their cross-border attack into Kharkiv around Lvov, we put out a piece that was looking at what this much-anticipated Russian campaign of the year was likely to look like, what, as far as we could tell, speaking to people who knew things that we didn't necessarily. Piecing together the intelligence, what we knew about the Russian deployments, about Russian likely objectives, and trying to analyze how it was going to go, where the Russians were putting their main efforts and so on. While we were preparing that for publication, the Russians preempted us by launching their offensive into Kharkiv. I remember muddling about a little bit, trying to desperately rewrite to make it relevant in this very fast-changing situation. But anyway, that was about, 2.5, 3 months ago now. So we've kind of gone back to that question, and it's not being flippant about it, but, a kind of half-time report, really, because the campaign is still very much ongoing. As you were reporting at the beginning of this podcast, the Russian offensive still hasn't culminated. So really, it was an opportunity to go back, look at what we thought was going to happen then, what has happened, and the way things are going. So that was the basic kind of brief.
Well, Roland, let's jump into it then. What was the plan, and how did that play out in reality?
Well, the Russians went into this, I think, with two objectives. One of them was very ambitious and maybe wishful thinking on their part, but not out with the realms of possibility. And that would have been the worst case scenario for the Ukrainians. That would have involved a massive strategic level breakthrough or a general collapse of the Ukrainian front, and possibly the Russians rolling all the way into Dnipro or even Kiev or something like that. There were definitely quite excited predictions about that, or doom-laden predictions about that from the Ukrainian or Western side at the time. That hasn't materialized, obviously. The second objective, the obvious objective, which they're still grinding on at, is this long-standing objective that Vladimir Putin laid out back in 2022, which is they called it the liberation, Ukraine called it the conquest, capturing everything that's left of the Donetsk region that's left in Ukrainian hands, because that has always been a one of Moscow's stated political aims. Even if you think that their true geopolitical goals will go much further, that's what they've definitely said they want to do. And obviously, if the Russians think that there's likely to be peace talks if Donald Trump wins the election, that the Ukrainians may be forced to the table to make concessions, the first order of business in any peace talks will be for the Russians to try and cement in whatever gains they have and say, look, if there's going to be a ceasefire line, it will be along the current line of contact. So that gives them an incentive to try and take as much land as possible. And if they come out of those peace talks with all of the Donbass, even if everything else is frozen, that's a victory they can sell back home and say to the Russian public, we went into this to do this and we brought it home, and there we are. So that was the objective. Now, the big plan seems to have been, we'll do this big surprise attack in Kharkiv. And the objective there was partly it was to make a buffer zone to stop the Ukrainians raiding across the border into Belgorod, which has agitated the Russians. But largely it was a diversion. The idea was to force the Ukrainians to take reserves from other parts of the front line, to shove them up to Kharkiv, to confine that offensive, and that way weaken the front in Donbass where the main effort was going to be. And the main effort was directed ultimately towards that conurbation of Kostiantinovka, Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, which is the heart of Ukrainian-controlled Donbass, and of course Pokrovsk. What's happened, the offensive into Kharkiv took place. It basically failed. The Ukrainians very well contained that. It made a good bit of progress in the first few days, but the Ukrainians have basically defeated that. Although the Russians are confined to a lodgement just a few kilometers deep on that side of the border. But it did succeed in pinning down Ukrainian reserves. A lot of Ukrainian reserves are still confined up at that end of the line. They're unable to be redeployed back into Donbass because that threat remains there. And that has allowed the Russians to continue to make steady advances in Donbass on there are several little points of attack, which is characteristic of kind of Valery Gerasimov's way of running battles. And the Russians have made progress in all of them. Slow progress, it's true. They haven't achieved this grand breakthrough. They definitely failed to exploit that moment. They failed to coordinate the big effort in Donbass with the effort in Kharkiv, which may have saved the Ukrainians. But they're still on the go. And although they've only made, at most in certain places, half a dozen, maybe a couple more kilometers, they are taking ground almost every day at several points up and down the line. As you were talking about just now, the main effort at the moment seems to be on Pokrovsk. If you can get to Pokrovsk, if you can cut that road, and that road is already under fire and pretty much gone as a supply route, that's a road between Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka, and you capture Pokrovsk, which is a transport hub, the rest of the defensive position in Donbass becomes much more precarious for the Ukrainians. So the bottom line is the Russians did not achieve the maximalist kind of very high-end objective that they went into the summer with. They are still making progress towards their more realistic goal, we could say. And the final point I think to make is that most of the people you talk to say the initial danger of a collapse seemed to have passed because the Ukrainians did make several decisions in April, perhaps quite late decisions, which look like they're going to avert disaster. So the mobilization law is beginning to get more people into the front line, although you see more of them arriving over the next few months. The Americans in April finally passing that aid bill has seen shells begin to arrive. So the disparity in artillery rounds has narrowed, but it's not closed. And the Ukrainians have got better at building defensive lines. Those were the three elements that were really worrying people looking at Ukraine.
So the Russians have failed in their maximalist objectives. They've failed in their more moderate objectives of taking the Donbass. I think they failed in the Kharkiv offensive. And I also think that while they have pulled troops away from other areas so that they couldn't rotate other areas and there were weaknesses elsewhere, although that's an advantage to the Russians, had the Russians just put those troops in whatever area you're talking about where the Ukrainian forces were initially taken from, you would have had the same effect and possibly a better effect. So instead of putting 50,000 troops up in Kharkiv and forcing the Ukrainians to pull troops away, if you put 50,000 troops in Chasiv Yar, you would have still had that overwhelming force and then you would have probably forced troops away from other areas of the front line to Chasiv Yar. I think even when you look at the biggest successes of Kharkiv, you would have had even more success had you just committed all of those troops and all of that equipment to any other given place on the front line. So I would totally agree with what the guys at the Telegraph are saying here, but I would actually say that Kharkiv was even more of a failure. But
Ukrainian preparations at the beginning of the offensive, all of those are getting stronger, but that doesn't mean that the Russian operation has yet failed or is going to fail.
Roland, several questions. Where do you think this goes over the next few weeks, months, if we can say anything? And in your stand first, and you've sort of talked about it a little bit, you've said there's been no grand breakthrough or Ukrainian collapse. Is there a sense among any of the people you talk to that either of those things could be just around the corner if enough of these cumulative advances get added together? And are we getting closer to that moment or not? What do people say?
I mean, the message I've got is that the immediate danger of that happening has passed and that the Russians may actually have missed the window in which to do that, simply because this moment of intense vulnerability when the Russians really had this massive advantage in men and in ammunition and in kit, that was back in spring when the Kharkiv offensive began, and that gap is slowly closed. But what is true is that the Ukrainians are still very short of men, right? There's still a massive shortage of manpower, and that means you don't have a large mobile reserve that you can use to plug the line. And you can still see that even though the immediate danger or the window for a general collapse or a Russian breakthrough seems to have been missed, the Ukrainians are still having to retreat. They're still being forced back. And even though there are these reports of very, very high Russian casualties, the bottom line is it's clearly not enough men available to plug lines to respond to crises at each point along the line where this is happening. And that's why you're seeing things like, for example, we saw the Russians launch a new offensive in between their two main efforts towards one main effort towards Chasiv Yar, the other one's towards Покровsk. And about a month ago, they began to move on Toretsk and New York, which lie halfway between those 2 points. And they hadn't made that move before. As I understand, there's an element of opportunism here. The Russians noticed that the Ukrainians had swapped out an exhausted, relatively weak brigade out of Chasiv Yar down to the Toretsk area and moved a fresher brigade from Toretsk up to the Chasiv Yar area. And the Russians thought, okay, we'll just keep on attacking the weaker unit, with the result that they've gained ground. And this apparently seems to be a tactic the Russians are following elsewhere, because it's a one way they can make gains. And that speaks to the fact that's the kind of problem you have, where instead of pulling units out of the line to refit and sending new units in who are fresh, you're just having to move them to what you hope will be a quieter part of the line. So that remains quite a significant weakness. As I said, the new mobilization law passed by the Rada and President Zelensky back in April, I think, that's going to start, they say that has raised an awful lot of men, and that is going to start seeing men, you're going to see increasing numbers of fresh troops entering the line over the next few months. But the sense is that the Russians will continue to advance and the Ukrainians will continue to lose ground, at least until the end of summer, maybe until the end of the year.
Thank you so much, James and Roland. Last week, I caught up with Telegraph correspondent Ben
there
Farmer,
you go.
who's recently finished a reporting trip in Ukraine.
So there you go. I think that's a pretty sound assessment of what's going on. It's exactly what I believe has been the case, where the Russians are taking huge casualties, but so are the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are mobilizing, but it came a bit late, and they're unable to rotate units without wanting to pull from those newly mobilized troops before they're fully trained. So they're having to pull from troops at quieter points on the front line. And as those troops rotate and move into new positions, they're obviously not dug in then, they're not prepared. And that's when the Russians have hit them. So we've seen this several times. Once it's happened in this Toretsk, New York area, where the group from Chasiv Yar, who've been under a lot of pressure, needed to go for a bit of an R&R, so they go to a quieter area of the front line. Well, the Russians basically followed them and attacked them in their new position just as they were rotating into that position, and that caused a bit of a disaster, and the Russians opportunistically took an awful lot of ground there. So yeah, the Russians are still taking land. They are still committing inordinate amounts of material and personnel at these problems. They are succeeding in eking out territorial gains, but it is coming at a huge cost. And the question is, when will they culminate, and at what will their status be when they do culminate? how many fresh troops are they getting in? What are the troops like that the Ukrainians are getting in compared to the troops that the Russians are getting in? How well equipped? We've heard, I think Zelensky complain that the new units that are being made are not well enough equipped. They are still a lot of equipment short for properly kitting out those new units. So there are lots of questions still to be answered. Is it going to be the case that the Ukrainians are going to want to take territory back by force, by conventional land warfare means, or will they have a mixture of air attacks and drones and attack drones that will allow their ground forces to take more land back, or will they wait for political activity to such as Russia collapsing internally from economic woes and not being able to sustain their war efforts, and that's how they take land back? There are all these options open. Is there going to be political pressure for commanders to attack and take land back in very costly ground-based actions? Who knows? Anyway, that's enough from me. Hopefully that was useful and interesting for you. Thanks for watching. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.